Have one for me in this year. In the name of gratitude, I buy myself this long and calming story in the shower, and I had to see it. What starts as an innocent accident spirals into a journey of emotional conflict and difficult choices. How do you handle a moment that challenges everything you thought you knew about boundaries and family? Before we dive into this dramatic story, don't forget to subscribe for more compelling tales, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Let's begin. The sound of water hitting the tile echoed through the hallway. It was unusual. The guest bathroom was hardly ever used, especially with the master bath and the upstairs shower both fully functional. My husband had insisted on that bathroom remodel last year, his grand idea to raise the house's value. It wasn't supposed to be a room anyone really used, but here I was, standing just outside the slightly ajar door. My curiosity piqued. My stepson Nathan was home for the summer, and I assumed he was the one in there. Still, something didn't add up. His things were always in the upstairs bathroom. Why use this one? I should have turned around. I should have let it go. But my feet moved of their own accord, carrying me toward the faint mist curling out through the open crack. The door wasn't locked. The thought struck me as odd. Nathan was meticulous about his privacy. I peeked in, a reflexive action. The scene before me froze me in place. Through the glass shower door, obscured slightly by fog, I saw him. The water streamed down his back, catching the curve of his muscles in the dim bathroom light. Nathan was more than the scrawny teenager I remembered from 3 summers ago. His broad shoulders and lean frame told the story of countless hours at the gym. For a moment, I couldn't look away. Guilt twisted in my stomach almost immediately, but my legs wouldn't move. Then, as if sensing my presence, he turned slightly, his profile coming into sharper view. A wave of panic gripped me, and I spun around, my heart racing. I clutched the edge of the doorframe for balance, my mind screaming at me to move. What the hell was I doing? I hurried back to the kitchen, my face burning. Minutes passed as I tried to shake the image from my mind. My hands were trembling as I attempted to chop vegetables for dinner, but the knife felt foreign in my grip. I couldn't concentrate. "What's wrong with me?" I whispered to the empty kitchen, setting the knife down. Nathan emerged a while later, his hair damp, dressed in his typical casual style, basketball shorts and a loose t-shirt. He gave me a small, polite smile as he grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge. "Hey," he said casually. I forced a smile, keeping my eyes on the cutting board. "Hey. Everything okay?" My voice came out strained. Just needed a quick shower. Didn't want to wake Dad upstairs." His tone was light, innocent, as if the moment in the bathroom hadn't happened. Of course, it hadn't. Not for him. He had no idea I'd been there. "That's thoughtful," I murmured, trying to sound nonchalant. "Dinner will be ready soon." He nodded, his attention shifting to his phone as he leaned against the counter. I stole a glance at him, the image of the shower flashing unbidden in my mind. I shook it off. He was just a kid. A young man, sure, but still my stepson. I couldn't let my mind wander. Doubt threw me, the image of the shower flashing, unbidden in my mind. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but the guilt lingered. Even as I climbed into bed next to my husband, the sound of Nathan's shower replayed in my head. It felt ridiculous, shameful even. This wasn't like me. The days that followed should have been ordinary. Nathan spent most of his time upstairs in his room or out with friends. I tried to keep my interactions with him brief, fearing that he might somehow sense the discomfort I was desperately trying to hide. But something subtle had shifted. Nathan began spending more time downstairs, lingering in the kitchen or on the living room couch. At first, I convinced myself it was just a coincidence, but over time, I noticed little things. How his eyes seemed to find mine when he thought I wasn't looking, or the way he'd ask unnecessary questions, keeping the conversation going, even when it had naturally run its course. One evening, as I wiped down the counters after dinner, he appeared in the doorway. "You're always cleaning," he said with a grin, leaning casually against the frame. "It doesn't clean itself," I replied lightly, avoiding his gaze. He stepped closer, grabbing a towel from the counter to help dry the dishes I had already laid out. "You don't have to do it all, you know. You should relax sometimes." I glanced at him, surprised by the comment. "Since when do you care about housework?" I teased, trying to inject some normalcy into the moment. Nathan laughed, his face lighting up in a way that made my chest tighten. "Maybe I just don't like seeing you doing all the work." His tone was playful, but there was something else there, something that made my stomach flutter uncomfortably. I forced a chuckle, taking the towel from his hands. "Go relax, I've got this." He didn't move. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice dropping slightly. "You know, I've missed this. Just being home. It's not the same at school." My throat tightened. His words were innocent enough, but the way he looked at me wasn't. It was a quiet intensity, like he was trying to see past the walls I was so desperately trying to keep up. "Well, we've missed having you here," I said, stepping away under the pretense of rinsing another dish. My hands trembled as I turned the faucet on. For the next few minutes, neither of us spoke. Nathan eventually returned to the living room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The tension that lingered after he left was suffocating, as if the air had thickened in his absence. I leaned against the counter, gripping its edge for support. What was happening? It wasn't just the moment in the shower. It was the way he looked at me now, the way his voice softened when we talked. It wasn't supposed to feel this way. He was my stepson, nothing more, nothing less. The next morning, I made a conscious effort to put some distance between us. I left the house early, running errands I didn't need to run. I spent longer at the grocery store than necessary, wandering aimlessly through the aisles just to avoid being home. By the time I returned, the house was quiet. My husband was at work, and Nathan's car was still in the driveway. I put away the groceries, telling myself it was fine. He was probably upstairs in his room. I could manage a few hours of normalcy. As I was setting the last of the bags on the counter, I heard footsteps behind me, then raised gun to fire. "Hey, you're back," Nathan said, his voice closer than I expected. I turned, startled to find him standing just a few feet away. His hair was slightly damp, and he wore a fitted t-shirt that clung to his lean frame. The sight of him sent a jolt through me, one I quickly suppressed. "Yeah, just running some errands," I said, my voice unnaturally bright. "How about you? What are you up to?" "Nothing much, just finished a workout." He motioned toward his water bottle on the counter, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Figured I'd help you unload since you're always so busy." "That's sweet of you," I said, avoiding his gaze as I reached for the nearest bag. As we worked side by side, the proximity became unbearable. I could feel the heat radiating from him, his presence too close, too overwhelming. Every small brush of his arm against mine felt like a spark, and I hated myself for noticing. Then he looked. At one point, I dropped a box of cereal, and we both reached for it at the same time. Our hands collided, and I froze. He didn't pull away immediately, Instead, his fingers lingered against mine, his touch warm and deliberate. "Sorry," I mumbled, snatching my hand back and turning away. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "It's okay," he said softly, his tone unreadable. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. I stayed busy, finding tasks to occupy my mind, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of his hand against mine, or the intensity of his gaze. That evening, as I sat on the couch pretending to read, Nathan joined me. He settled on the opposite end, but the space between us felt non-existent. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the television. "You've been avoiding me," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. My head snapped up, my cheeks flushing. "What? No, I haven't." "Yes, you have," he insisted, his expression serious. "Did I do something wrong?" The genuine concern in his voice made my chest ache. I shook my head quickly, forcing a smile. "Of course not. Why would you think that?" The smile faded. "I don't know." He leaned back, studying me with those piercing eyes. "It just feels like, I don't know, like something's changed." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. I swallowed hard, desperately searching for an escape. "You're imagining things," I said lightly, standing to gather the empty coffee mug from the table. "I've just been busy, that's all." "Mom," he said quietly, and the words stopped me in my tracks. I turned to find him looking at me with an expression I couldn't read, one that made my breath catch in my throat. "Yes?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "Never mind," he said finally, shaking his head. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. I could feel it in the way he looked at me, the way the air seemed to thicken between us. It was something, and it terrified me. The unease grew with each passing day. I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but it felt like I was walking a tightrope, each step precariously close to unraveling the fragile balance of our lives. Nathan's presence was everywhere, in the house, in my thoughts, in moments that should have been ordinary but felt anything but. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the guest room, Nathan appeared in the doorway. His casual posture belied the intensity in his gaze. His eyes were focused, just as they had the last time I saw him. "Need some help?" he asked, stepping inside before I could respond. "No, I've got it," I said quickly, my hands moving faster, as if the pile of clothes were a shield between us. He didn't leave. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes following my movements. The air in the room felt charged, heavy with unspoken tension. I focused on the task at hand, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. But as he stands, he hangs his head, peering at me. "You've been different lately," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. My hands stilled for a moment before I forced a laugh. "Different how?" "I don't know," he said, leaning forward. "You're quieter. Avoiding me, I think." "I'm not avoiding you," I lied, keeping my back to him as I placed a neatly folded shirt in the drawer. "Are you sure?" His voice was softer now, laced with something that made my pulse quicken. I turned to face him, determined to put an end to this conversation. "Nathan, you're imagining things. I've just been busy, that's all." He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stood, closing the distance between us in 2 steps. I could feel the warmth of his body, the faint scent of his cologne stirring something in me I didn't want to acknowledge. "Come here, please." "Okay," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you say so." He left without another word, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding in my chest. I clutched the edge of the dresser for support, my breath coming in shallow gasps. This had to stop. I couldn't let it go any further. Whatever was happening, whatever I was feeling, it was wrong. I was his stepmother. This was my home, my family, my marriage. I had to remember that. That night, I decided to talk to my husband about us, about how distant we'd become. It wasn't a conversation I looked forward to, but I needed something to anchor me, to remind me of what mattered. He came home late, as usual, his tie askew and his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. I waited until he'd finished his dinner and was nursing a glass of whiskey in the living room. "Can we talk?" I asked, sitting beside him on the couch. He glanced at me, his brows furrowing. "What's wrong?" "I just feel like we've been so distant lately," I said, choosing my words carefully. "You're always working, and I guess I just miss us." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's been a busy year, you know that." "Not—" "I do," I said softly, "but I don't want us to drift apart." He nodded, his eyes softening. "I'll try to make more time for us. Maybe we can plan a weekend away soon." "Yeah." I nodded. I smiled, relief washing over me. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. I needed this, needed to feel connected to him again. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to bake. It was something I hadn't done in a while, and I hoped the familiarity of it would bring some semblance of peace. The smell of cinnamon filled the kitchen as I pulled a tray of muffins from the oven. Nathan walked in, his hair tousled from sleep. He wore a plain t-shirt and sweatpants, his bare feet padding softly on the tile. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough from sleep. "Morning," I replied, keeping my focus on the muffins. He leaned against the counter, watching me as I worked. "You didn't have to make all this." "I felt like it," I said simply, brushing past him to grab a plate. As I set the muffins on the table, he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. It was a fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt through me. I pulled my hand back quickly, avoiding his gaze. "Thanks," he said, his voice low. For the next few minutes we ate in silence. The air between us was thick with tension, and I struggled to find anything to say that would break it. "Do you have plans today?" I asked, forcing casualness into my tone. "Not really," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe I'll go for a run later." "Sounds good," I said, keeping my eyes on my plate. He didn't leave right away. Instead, he lingered, his gaze heavy on me. When he finally stood, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Later that evening, as I sat on the patio with a book, Nathan joined me again. He carried 2 cups of tea, setting one down in front of me. "Thought you might like this," he said, sitting across from me. "Thank you," I said, surprised by the gesture. We sat in silence for a while, the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves filling the night air. It should have been a peaceful moment, but the weight of his presence made it anything but. "I've been thinking," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "About what?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "About us." His words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. I stared at him, my heart pounding. "Nathan, there is no us. You're my stepson." "I know," he said quickly, his voice soft but firm. I can't stop thinking about you." His confession hit me like a tidal wave, knocking the breath from my lungs. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the patio floor. "This has to stop," I said, my voice shaking. "Whatever you think this is, it's not." He stood too, his expression a mixture of frustration and something else, something that made my resolve waver. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "Good night, Nathan," I said, turning and walking back into the house. I closed the door behind me, leaning against it, as tears pricked my eyes. This had gone too far. I had to put an end to it, no matter what it took. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance. I made a point of being out of the house as much as possible, long grocery trips, unnecessary errands, even volunteering for an event at the community center just to keep my mind occupied. It worked to a degree. When I wasn't home, the tension couldn't follow me. But the evenings were a different story. Nathan seemed to sense my unease and made no effort to leave me alone. It wasn't overt, not enough for anyone to notice, but I could feel it. His presence, his watchful eyes, the way his tone softened when he spoke to me. It was unnerving, and yet a small part of me found it comforting? No. I pushed the thought away every time it crept in. One evening, while my husband was still at work, Nathan cornered me in the kitchen. I was preparing dinner, chopping vegetables with deliberate precision to keep my hands steady. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low but firm. I froze for a moment before continuing my task. "I've been busy." "That's not true." He stepped closer, his tone softening. "Did I do something to upset you?" The knife hovered midair as I turned to face him. His expression was sincere, almost boyish, and it made my heart ache. "Of course not," I said quickly. "Why would you think that?" "Because you don't talk to me anymore," he said, his voice laced with hurt. "We used to sit and talk, laugh. Now you can't even look at me." I opened my mouth to respond but faltered. What could I say? That I was terrified of the feelings I couldn't control? That I was ashamed of the way my heart raced when he was near? I couldn't. Instead, I said, "You're imagining things, Nathan." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, he didn't speak. When he did, his words cut through me. "You're lying." I flinched, the knife slipping from my grip and clattering onto the counter. "I think you should leave," I said, my voice trembling. "Please." Nathan's eyes searched mine, his expression softening as he stepped back. "I didn't mean to upset you," he said quietly. I miss the way things were." I turned away, unable to face him any longer. The sound of his retreating footsteps was both a relief and a heartbreak. That night, as I lay in bed next to my husband, I stared at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressing down on me. I could hear the faint hum of Nathan's music through the walls, a reminder of the tension that now permeated every corner of the house. My husband stirred beside me, pulling me closer in his sleep. I closed my eyes, willing myself to find solace in his embrace, but the image of Nathan's face, his hurt, his longing, kept intruding. I felt like I was being torn in two. The next morning, I decided enough was enough. I couldn't keep running. I had to face this, to reestablish boundaries and restore some semblance of normalcy. Nathan was in the backyard, lounging on a deck chair with a book in hand. The morning sun cast a golden glow over his features, and for a moment I hesitated. Then I steeled myself and stepped outside. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. He looked up surprised and nodded. "Of course." I sat down across from him, clasping my hands tightly to keep them from trembling. Nathan, I need to be honest with you. These past few weeks, things have felt off. And I think it's because we've lost sight of our boundaries. Boundaries, he echoed, his brow furrowing. Yes, I said firmly. You are my stepson, and I'm your stepmother. That's all we can be. Anything else? It's not right. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the ground. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I know, but that doesn't change how I feel. I felt my chest tighten. Neith, I'm not saying it's right, he interrupted, his voice stronger now. I'm just saying it's there, and I don't know how to make it go away. His vulnerability caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Finally, I said, You don't have to make it go away. You just have to accept that it can't go anywhere. We both do. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. I understand. I stood, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. I hope you do. As I walked back into the house, I felt the weight on my shoulders lighten ever so slightly. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. The following days were quieter. Nathan kept his distance, and I focused on my marriage, throwing myself into every effort to bridge the gap that had formed between me and my husband. We planned a weekend getaway, something we hadn't done in years, and for the first time in weeks, I felt hopeful. On the morning of our trip, as we loaded the car, Nathan came to say goodbye. He hugged his father first, clapping him on the back, before turning to me. Favorite room of the island, have a great trip, he said, his smile warm but subdued. Thank you, I said, my voice steady. As we pulled out of the driveway, I glanced back at the house, at Nathan standing in the doorway. He waved, and I waved back, a bittersweet feeling settling over me. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in weeks, it felt like I could see the path forward. The weekend away with my husband was exactly what I needed. A break from the tension, the chaos, and the unspoken feelings that had consumed me over the past few weeks. We spent long hours walking by the beach, eating at quaint restaurants, and talking about everything but the stress that had hung over our marriage. It was refreshing, a reminder of why we had built this life together in the first place. Yet even as I tried to immerse myself in the moment, I couldn't completely shake Nathan from my thoughts. He lingered at the edges of my mind, an uninvited ghost haunting every quiet moment. I told myself it was guilt, that I needed to work harder to put things right. But deep down, I knew it was more complicated than that. When we returned home late Sunday evening, the house was dark and quiet. Nathan had left a note on the counter. Went to a friend's for the weekend. Hope you had a great trip. There was no relief in his absence, only an empty ache that I couldn't explain. I busied myself with unpacking and laundry, trying to distract myself from the void that seemed to settle over the house. Over the next week, Nathan's behavior was markedly different. He was polite, but distant. His presence more like a shadow than a person. He spent most of his time in his room or out with friends, and when we did cross paths, our conversations were brief and formal. It was what I had wanted, what I had asked for. And yet, it left me feeling hollow. One evening, as I sat in the living room flipping aimlessly through channels, Nathan walked in. He hesitated at the doorway, as if unsure whether to stay or go. Finally, he sat down on the far end of the couch, keeping a careful distance. "How was your trip?" he asked, his voice neutral. It was nice, I said, glancing at him. We had a good time. That's good, he said, nodding. Silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. I set the remote down, turning to face him. Nathan, I want us to be okay. He looked at me, his eyes searching. I thought we were. He sighed. I mean, really okay? I don't want things to feel strained between us. They don't have to be, he said simply. But I can't pretend nothing happened. Can you? His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but found I didn't have an answer. I'm not asking for anything, he continued. I don't want to lose you, even if it's only as family. I felt tears prick my eyes, and I quickly looked away. You're not going to lose me, I said quietly. I promise. He nodded, his expression softening. Okay. In the days that followed, we found a tentative rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. We talked more about his classes, his plans for the future, and mundane things like movies and books. Slowly, the tension began to ease, replaced by something quieter and more manageable. When the summer came to an end and Nathan prepared to return to college, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. We had found a fragile peace, but the distance would make it easier to hold on to. On the morning of his departure, he hugged his father tightly before turning to me. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between us. Take care of yourself, I said, my voice catching slightly. You too, he replied, his smile tinged with something bittersweet. As he drove away, I stood on the porch, watching until his car disappeared from view. The house felt impossibly quiet in his absence, and for the first time, I allowed myself to cry. Not from guilt or regret, but from the weight of everything I had held back. Life returned to normal in the months that followed. My husband and I found a stronger footing in our relationship, and I threw myself into my work and hobbies. Nathan called occasionally, his voice bright and full of stories about his classes and friends. Our conversations were warm, easy, and free of the tension that had once defined them. Yet every now and then, I would catch myself thinking about him, wondering what might have been if things had been different. It was a fleeting thought, one I quickly pushed aside. I had made my choice, and I had no regrets. But in the quiet moments, when the house was still and the memories crept in, I couldn't help but wonder if he thought about me too. The air between Nathan and me grew heavier with each passing day, thick with words left unsaid. I had tried to create distance, to rebuild the boundaries that had once felt so natural, but his presence lingered. He wasn't doing anything outright, no actions I could point to and blame, but it was in the subtle ways he looked at me, the quiet moments when his gaze lingered just a second too long. It was late one evening, after my husband had gone to bed, that everything came to a head. I was sitting in the living room, my book open but unread, the silence of the house only amplifying my restless thoughts. Nathan appeared in the doorway, his frame silhouetted by the faint glow of the kitchen light. "Can I sit?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and he settled into the chair across from me. For a few moments we sat in silence, the only sound the ticking of the wall clock. I could feel his eyes on me, waiting, and I knew this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. "You've been distant," he said finally, breaking the silence. I sighed, setting the book down on my lap. "I've just been busy." "That's not true," he said, his tone firm but not accusing. It feels like you're avoiding me." I met his gaze, my heart pounding. "Nathan, I'm not avoiding you. I'm just trying to keep things normal." "Normal?" he echoed, leaning forward slightly. "What's normal about this? About us?" I stiffened, his words cutting too close to the truth. "Nathan, stop. We can't do this." "Do what?" he asked, his voice softening. "Talk? Be honest with each other?" "It's not about honesty," I said, my voice trembling. "It's about boundaries." She He shook his head, frustration flickering in his eyes. "Boundaries? You're acting like I'm trying to—" He stopped himself, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to hurt you. I feel like I've done something wrong, and I don't know how to fix it." My breath caught in my throat. "You haven't done anything wrong," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But this, whatever this is, it has to stop. It's not right." Nathan's expression softened, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I know it's not right," he said quietly, "but that doesn't make it any easier." The vulnerability in his voice broke something inside me. I wanted to comfort him, to erase the tension and hurt between us, but I couldn't. Doing so would only blur the lines further, and I couldn't let that happen. "I'm sorry," I said, standing abruptly. "I think you should go to bed." He hesitated for a moment, as if considering saying more, but then he nodded and stood. "Good night," he said softly, before retreating down the hallway. I stood there long after he was gone, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a storm cloud. I knew things couldn't go on like this, but I had no idea how to fix them. The tension in the house was unbearable after that night. I could feel it in the way Nathan moved, careful and calculated, as though he was walking on eggshells. I wasn't any better. I avoided being alone with him, keeping conversations polite and short. Yet, the distance only magnified the unresolved tension. Something had to give. One afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at the window. My husband was at work, and Nathan had been holed up in his room for hours. I thought about how we had arrived here, about how one innocent moment had unraveled so much. I felt torn between the life I had built and the storm Nathan's presence had stirred within me. The sound of footsteps broke my reverie. I turned to see Nathan standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice tentative. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to decline, but something in his eyes, a mix of determination and vulnerability, compelled me to nod. "Okay." He sat across from me, folding his hands on the table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was deafening, filled with the weight of all the things we hadn't said. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady but quiet, "about what you said the other night, about boundaries." Looking at him with eyes full of wariness, I nodded, bracing myself for whatever was coming. "You're right," he continued, his gaze fixed on his hands. "This isn't fair to you, or to me, or to Dad." His mention of my husband sent a pang of guilt through me, but I didn't interrupt. "I think I've been holding on to something that isn't real," Nathan said, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know what I was looking for. Maybe it was attention or connection or—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I don't know." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "Nathan, you're young. It's easy to confuse feelings when you're going through so much." He looked up at me, his eyes glassy. "I don't think it's just that. Oh, his words hung in the air, but I couldn't let them take root. I needed to end this, to put everything back in its proper place. Nathan, I said gently, leaning forward. You're an amazing person. You're smart, kind, and full of potential. But what's happening here, it's a symptom of something else. You've been through a lot, adjusting to a new family, a new life. It's natural to feel confused. Do you feel confused? He asked, his voice so soft I barely heard it. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't lie to him, not outright. But I couldn't give him the truth either. Not the truth that would only deepen the rift between us. I think we're both trying to make sense of things, I said carefully. But what matters is that we do it in a way that doesn't hurt anyone. He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of the world rested on them. I don't want to hurt you, he said. I know, I said, reaching across the table to place my hand over his. And I don't want to hurt you either. The contact was brief, a gesture of reassurance, but it felt like a turning point. Nathan pulled his hand back, leaning back in his chair with a deep breath. I think I need to get away for a while, he said suddenly. Maybe go back to school early, stay with a friend or something. His words caught me off guard, but as they sank in, I realized he was right. The distance would be good for both of us. It would give us space to breathe, to heal, to rebuild our relationship on safer ground. I think that's a good idea, I said softly, though the thought of him leaving left an ache in my chest. You should focus on yourself, on your future. He nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. Yeah, I think I'll do that. Nathan packed his things over the next few days. He didn't say much, but there was a quiet resolve in his actions that I respected. We kept our interactions light, avoiding anything too emotional. It was easier that way. The morning he left, my husband and I stood in the driveway as he loaded his car. My husband clapped him on the back, offering fatherly advice about staying focused on school and not partying too much. Nathan grinned, promising to call often. When it was my turn to say goodbye, I hesitated. He hugged me briefly, his embrace warm but careful. And when he pulled back, there was a look in his eyes that I couldn't quite decipher. Take care of yourself, I said, my voice trembling slightly. You too, he replied, his smile soft and sincere. As his car disappeared down the street, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The house was quieter without him, and though the tension was gone, it left behind an emptiness I couldn't ignore. Over the next few months, life found a new rhythm. My husband and I grew closer, reconnecting in ways we hadn't in years. We took weekend trips, spent more time together in the evenings, and talked about our future with a renewed sense of hope. Nathan kept his word, calling regularly to check in. Our conversations were easy and light, free of the undercurrent that had once defined them. He seemed happy, thriving in his studies and making new friends. I was proud of him, and though I missed him, I knew the distance was what we both needed. There were moments, late at night when the house was silent, that I thought about him, about the connection we had shared and the line we had come dangerously close to crossing. But those moments were fleeting, and I reminded myself that we had made the right choice. We had done the hard thing, the right thing, and in the end, it had brought us both peace. The day Nathan came home for the holidays, I felt a twinge of nervousness as I waited for him to arrive. But when he walked through the door, his smile warm and genuine, I knew we were going to be okay. "Hey, Mom," he said, pulling me into a hug. "Welcome home," I said, my heart full of relief and gratitude. The past was behind us, a chapter closed, and the future felt brighter than it had in a long time.